Well, our next speaker is from Prairie View A&M, which is a land grant school, which has a federally funded cooperative extension. It delivers practical research knowledge to agriculture in 35 different counties. And if you don't know anything about cooperative extension, it really has a huge impact, especially in the agricultural communities. Obviously, insects are a very important part of agriculture. And we have with us an entomologist that works in this extension area. If you can get on the website, you will see some of his handouts on pollinator gardens, as well as educational material. Some of it's really cute that's on YouTube. So he's done a lot to educate people about bugs. When he was in kindergarten, he got interested in insects. And a lot of children do, fireflies and butterflies. My favorite one was little beetles. So he has gone on and spent his whole life working with understanding insects. And he got a degree in entomology from the State College in New Mexico. And he is today going to speak to us about some different kinds of approaches for pollinator insects and their ecological and biological factors. Nathan, take it on.
All right, thank you very much. Today we're going to be talking a little bit about unique pollinators. And one of the reasons why we kind of chose this subject is because as we work with plants, we have a farm at Prairie View A&M. One of the things that we realize is how important pollinators are, but we also realize that there are a lot of different species out there and that we want to educate people about some of the lesser known species, especially the insect pollinators that are out there helping our crops, forests and deserts and all sorts of different ecosystems. So first of all, I'd like to talk a little bit about how pollination actually works. So, and I actually just had this conversation today with some of my coworkers in Extension. But essentially what happens is flying animals will do a flyby of fields, sometimes forests and other locations, and they're attracted there by smell. So what happens is when we smell, for example, the mountain laurel and the strong great Kool-Aid smell, that's going to be increased by probably like 100-fold for most pollinators. They're going to smell that so strongly, but they're also going to combine that sense of smell with ultraviolet sight. So they're actually going to see a whole bunch of really bright colors that are actually directing them to where the pollen and the nectar is. And so they're, of course, going to go after those blooms. Typically, your insects are actually going to go after yellow, orange, and purple colors, whereas birds are going to stick to reds and pinks, sometimes oranges. And typically, each type of pollinator has different plants that they specifically look for. The other interesting thing is that specifically for hummingbirds and sometimes for bees, similar species might actually have different preferred plants. So for example, the comparison would be, for example, bees in Texas might prefer bee balm, but bees, the same species in maybe West Texas might prefer different species like heather or bluebonnet. So it really depends on what kind of plant species are closest to where they live. And so, as I said, the blooms have sort of a signal. So it functions as like a landing pad. So the insects and other animals know where to land and find that nectar. And so that nectar is actually a primary food source, but a lot of insects, especially your bees and some of your butterflies even, will use that pollen for bedding as well as a source of protein. So pollen is actually very healthy for insects and they need a lot of energy. Their wings have a lot of muscles, a lot more than you would think, and they need that energy, that pollen, to be able to essentially function and to fly. And so what they'll do, insects will gather the pollen on their bodies, and some of them will actually scrape that pollen to specific parts, whether it's their head or maybe on their back or their legs sometimes. Whereas birds will typically use their heads. They'll actually rub their heads against the area where the pollen is, and that's how they transfer that pollen. And so birds actually prefer flowers that don't have a strong sense of smell because they don't really smell well. Their focus is going to be on sense of sight. So they need those really bright bright ultraviolet oranges, reds, and pinks to attract them. So once the pollinators move from bloom to bloom, fertilization is going to occur. And what's going to happen is pollen will go from one bloom to another bloom of a similar or same species, and that's going to result in cross-pollination. However, cross-pollination can actually occur in different types of plants as long as they're in the same group. So for example, you can have bees or butterflies pollinate lemons and then move to oranges, and they'll actually cross-pollinate, and the next plant that grows from the seed that's developed will actually be a mix of lemon and orange. So we actually had that happen, and one of my coworkers had a backyard that had lemon and oranges, and she brought one of them to work, and it was a lemon, but it was the size of an orange. It was much larger than usual. And so cross-pollination is actually how a lot of plant breeding occurs. So you have different colors or different physiological types. So pollinators aren't just there to help our plants grow, they're also there to help us with breeding. So a little bit about the title, unique pollinators. What exactly makes a pollinator unique? So I usually define unique pollinators as a new species or a species that's not seen as commonly, but it also can be, especially in our communities, it can be species and families and groups of insects and other pollinators that people don't know about as much, or that aren't really seen in an area. For example, a New Mexico pollinator might be unique to Texas if we see it in Texas. Additionally, they're going to inhabit specific areas. So as I mentioned before, pollinators in East Texas and pollinators in West Texas are going to feed on different plants, and they're going to live in different areas because the climate is different, the elevation is different. There's a whole bunch of ecosystem factors that are actually going to change how they operate. And that's also going to affect their growth as well. And of course, we know that pollinators are beneficial. But the interesting thing is that plants will actually tailor their biology for specific pollinators. And so essentially each pollinator will be beneficial for a specific type of plant. So a little bit about their habitats. So fruit tree groves are going to be a very common place to see pollinators, because many pollinators actually feed on fruit themselves, but they also feed on the flowers, and the flowers are biologically tailored to attract pollinators, both because of the color and because of the way they actually grow, in the sense that they put out. They're going to specifically attract all these different types of species. Of course, your vegetables, fruit crop fields, lots of roadsides. So a lot of your bees and your hummingbirds are going to be seen frequently on roadsides and fields near where civilizations are. And that's just because that's where your native wild plants are growing most commonly. Of course, prairies, because prairies are typically a mix of a whole bunch of different species. So you're actually going to get, I would say, prairies and forests and possibly deserts will be where you see a lot of different species that you kind of have a crossover in different types of pollinators. So starting off with each group of pollinators, I'd like to start with flies, because people typically don't see flies or think of flies as pollinators. And so you have in the picture to the right here is a syrphid fly, also known as a hoverfly. And they're actually unique because they, unlike most of the other fly species, not only are they pollinators, but they also mimic bees and wasps. So a lot of your predators are going to stay away from them. And a lot of people mistake these for bees or wasps. And so they see them and they don't think fly, they think yellow and black equals bee or equals wasp. Additionally, their larvae are actually beneficial to farmers, because they're actually going to feed on other insect pests. And then once they go through their metamorphosis, they become pollinators. Oh, also a way to tell the difference between hoverflies and bees and wasps is that hoverflies actually have a special vein, and you can actually see it in the picture. If you look at the left wing there, the vein that you can see kind of coming down like at a 45-degree angle all the way down to the tip of the wing, that vein is not present in bees or wasps. So there's around 6,000 or more species of hoverflies. That number continues to grow just because we're always discovering new species. Sometimes sometimes entomologists decide, well, two species look alike, so there'll just be one species. So the number is always going up and going down. So it just really depends on currently what new species are found and how the entomologists want to rearrange everything. Of course, you also have bee flies. So bee flies are called bee flies because they look like bees. They're very large and fuzzy, and they're great at gathering pollen. They don't put pollen in the basket the way bees do. They actually just gather it all over their body, and then as they go from bloom to bloom, typically that's how they transfer pollen. Typically, your flies are going to be very common in not only prairies but also your roadsides. They go after those smaller blooms that they can fit on. A lot of times you'll see these flies hovering in like your urban gardens and your farms. They'll go after like your tomato flowers and pumpkins and strawberries as well. So they're definitely, flies are actually said to be the second most important pollinator after bees. Now, also the bombylius, which is the group that bee flies belong to, their larvae are also are semi-pests because even though they eat pollen, which is good because that means they're transferring pollen, sometimes they do eat bee larvae. So they'll go into, some of these insects will go into bee nests and they'll take honey and nectar, they'll eat the larvae. So they can be minor pests for beekeepers. And of course, mosquitoes are also pollinators. While the female mosquitoes actually drink human blood, the male mosquitoes are pollinators. They only drink nectar. All right, and now we move to our beetles, our Coleoptera. So beetles are the largest insect order. So I would say that beetles are definitely one of the most important insects just because they're involved in not only pollination, pest control, they function as pests themselves, also cleanup of rotten leaves and other things like that. So they definitely have a wide range of different functions in both wild and agricultural ecosystems. So they'll actually feed on some of your flower beetles or your Schaefer beetles, which is what's shown to the left here. They have very fuzzy undersides, and what they'll do is they'll sit on flowers, and some of them will go after other insects. Some of them will just feed on pollen. Some of them will actually eat the flowers themselves. So they're a minor pest, but at the end of the day, they are still transferring pollen, so that still really works in our favor. And these beetles to the left here are actually June beetles, yes. And they're called the emerald green June beetle, and they typically are found in fruit crops. So especially like your peaches, apples, pears, anything that's like in a fruit tree grove, they're very common in that area. So they're specifically important for pollination of your fruits. And then of course you have your soft wing flower beetles, which are metallic black and red, and they are actually going to feed on prey, but they hang around on flowers waiting for prey, so they're still transferring pollen. The stuff that I have here in the parentheses that has the names, those are the resources where I actually received the information from. They have different articles and things like that in case you're interested in checking those out. So when it comes to evolution, beetles were actually some of the first pollinators. Since beetles are one of the insects that were around for the longest. And that includes like your blister beetles, which are a little bit toxic to humans, your longhorn beetles, which are very long and skinny with very long antennae. And some of these actually feed on milkweed and some other wildflowers. So they're definitely important for prairies. You'll see them frequently. You also see longhorn beetles sometimes at night when your outside lights are on. They tend to like hanging around those areas as well. All right, wasps. So typically wasps aren't thought of as pollinators, but there are several species that really do enjoy eating pollen and nectar, while most wasps are actually predators and feed on other insects. So the interesting thing about wasps that also makes them a good pollinator is their name, Hymenoptera. So the name means joined wing, and the reason they're called that, and it's really not easy to see in the pictures, but the front wing and the hind wing have hooks, and it allows them to connect their wings together, and it makes them fly really well. So they can actually fly very far and go from bloom to bloom very easily. As I said, most wasps are feeding on other insects. Some of them are parasitoids. The two in the pictures here are both parasitoids. So they actually lay their eggs on or near other insects. And then the larvae are the ones that actually feed on the pests. So like cockroaches and aphids and caterpillars and other pests. The males are typically only pollinators. They don't feed on meat whatsoever. However, the females are the ones that can sting and lay the eggs in the pests. Wasps also have a caste system, just like bees. So they'll live, the two here in the picture are solitary, but the wasps such as yellow jackets and hornets, they actually live in a hive and sometimes underground. And what they'll do is they'll feed on caterpillars and ants and bees and other insects, but the males will feed only on nectar and the females will also feed on nectar and pollen. And they actually use pollen as bedding for their nests and to build their hive as well. And they make for great pest control. So they're both pollinators and they're cleaning up our environment of pest insects. So some more things about wasps. So I mentioned a little bit about yellow jackets and paper wasps, which are all in the same family, and they're all true social. So they have the caste system where they have a queen and then the workers and the drones. And so basically what they do is they divvy out the chores to different wasps. Some of them are out there gathering prey, some gather nectar. So some of them also feed on human foods as well. The tarantula hawk wasp, which is the big blue one in the previous slide, is actually a predator of spiders, but they really love blooms like the bird of paradise, hibiscus. The mountain laurel is another one that that type of wasp will also enjoy. And of course, you have your fig wasps. Fig wasps are very important for growers of figs. And so if you're in a tropical area, they are a keystone species, meaning they are super important and they are one of the only species that will pollinate figs. And so the removal of that species will result in the removal of other plants as well. So spiders. Now spiders, I will say, unlike most of the other animals we're talking about today, spiders are the only ones that don't actually eat pollen or nectar. It simply has to do with their actual location. So when you see a spider, where they typically located. So as I mentioned, they are traditionally predators, sometimes spinning webs, sometimes hunting, but a lot of your spiders actually do live on blooms. So orb spiders, like the web that's pictured to the left, they spin their webs in trees, bushes, sometimes between flowers. And so what they'll do is they won't always sit in the middle of the web. They'll actually stand on the plant. And so they're actually gathering pollen accidentally that way. The one that I would say is a primary pollinator for spiders is definitely the crab spider. They are very brightly colored. And the reason for that is because they live on flowers and they actually blend in so that their predators as well as their prey can't see them. And what they'll do is instead of spinning webs like the orb weavers, they'll hide there and then they'll wait for like a butterfly or a moth or a mosquito to show up, and then they'll grab it and eat it. The interesting thing that I recently learned was that crab spiders are actually protecting flowering plants not only from pests, but they actually use flowering plants to lure pests in. So they are actually somehow attracted to those flowers because they see that pollinators are going there frequently. And so they see that as like a quick food spot. Also, they're going to help pollinators out because if they're eating aphids and other pests, that means that there's more food for pollinators, meaning pollinators are going to be frequenting that area a lot more. So spiders are helping both the good and the bad guys in that sense. True bugs. The interesting thing with true bugs, out of all the other animals we're talking about today, is that they have piercing mouth parts. So they have almost like a needle. And what they'll do is they'll, instead of injecting, they stab into a plant and they remove the fluids. And that includes nectar as well. So the milkweed bug, which is the bright orange and black one here, along with the longhorn beetle of milkweed and the milkweed butterflies, the monarch butterflies, are pollinators of milkweed specifically. And they also have that same toxicity that monarch butterflies have as well. And so they're definitely going to be helping with the spread of milkweed just because they're feeding solely on that. And so I would say that also helps monarchs and other butterflies because they're spreading that food source. There are other true bugs out there. True bugs are typically either pests or predators, but some of them do live on wildflowers and alfalfa and some of the other crops. And so they're still going to feed on nectar as well. And of course, bats. So bats are typically nocturnal, meaning they feed at night. Some are crepuscular, meaning they feed between sundown and sunup. So they're not just nighttime flyers, but typically they're insectivores. So they're feeding on your moths and mosquitoes and other pests, and they'll use echolocation. So they'll send out like a sound signal, and then it will bounce back. So if anyone knows the superhero Daredevil, that's how he can see, because he uses that same sort of, he uses sound to form an image. That's kind of what bats are doing. So they can actually pinpoint where mosquitoes and some of the other pests are. However, bats have a strong sweet tooth. So a lot of them, while they're feeding on, these flies and mosquitoes, they're also going to visit your lantanas and your moonflower. But there are fruit bats and desert dwelling bats that feed on cacti and other night blooming plants, typically succulents. And what will happen is they'll feed on this, and then they'll come back a few weeks later and the fruits will be there. And those fruits are used by humans, bats, and other pollinators as a food source. Because remember, there are a lot of pollinators that enjoy fruit as well. So the bats are very unique because they're one of the only pollinators where they're actually benefiting from their own pollination. So most of the other pollinators will just drink the nectar and then leave, take pollen with them and then leave. Bats are going to continue to come back to the same bloom because those are what provides the fruit. And hummingbirds, which are diurnal only, unlike most of the other insects and pollinators. Hummingbirds are not insects, by the way. Just wanted to point that out. So they are very unique because they don't eat pollen. They only eat nectar, sugary drinks. If you leave out fruit or like juice or anything that kind of breaks down and those sugars break down, that will also be a food source for them. Interestingly, some are named on their appearance. So there's a black-chinned, which has a dark blackish purple, almost like what's the name? It's where it kind of like changes color. Then of course you have your ruby-throated, which has the red throat. They love really, really bright blooms, like especially if they're in clusters, spikes, or bells, like the flower on the right here. Especially if it's red, pink, or orange, those are going to be their favorite colors. And so sorrel is going to be a favorite. They're also going to go after trumpet vine, hibiscus, and some of those other type of really large bell-shaped plants as well. All right. So this is just a short list of some of the blooms that some of these pollinators enjoy and that in general pollinators enjoy that I have had very good luck with. Alfalfa, just because it's great. One of the things about alfalfa is that not only is it great for pollinators, but a lot of like meat spiders and other beneficial predators and parasitoids will actually live in alfalfa just because it grows so tall and the flowers smell really strong. And so that is a great attractant for pollinators. Of course, bluebonnets. Bluebonnets are very good for hummingbirds and for bees. Milkweed, of course, we mentioned the milkweed bug as well as milkweed butterfly, but many of your other pollinators will feed on milkweed as well, including bees. Butterfly weed. Butterfly weed is one of those that's going to be fed on by every pollinator. I think I've even seen hummingbirds feed on butterfly weed as well. That goes the same for bee balm because of the color, that bright pink color. In fact, that's one of the plants that we included in our garden up at Prairie View. Of course, your salvia. There's two types of salvia that I see. I believe there's a red type and like an indigo blue type. Both are great for bees and hummingbirds. Mexican sunflower, I see that around here quite a bit. Your coneflower is one of the staples. Whenever I plant coneflower, I get lots of pollinators for that. I would like to talk about goldenrod because goldenrod is one of those that I have learned is very important in the autumn season, which we are in right now. As pollinators are trying to gather pollen, your wasps are even trying to gather nectar and some of the other resources. Goldenrod kind of has a long growth season. I don't know as much about it as some of the other plants, but I do know that pollinators use it as a primary nectar and pollen source during the autumn season. So that's definitely one I would recommend including. And it grows wild. It grows wild around here, almost like a weed. Rue is a good one. It's an herb as well, so it's going to have a strong scent. So it's great for attracting of course, your bees and butterflies. Heather is also a good one. I don't know if heather is native. I don't think it is. But thistle is the one that's native. And while that's usually seen as a weed, that one is also very common. So if you notice, most of these are going to be in those yellow, purple, orange coloration. And if you look at the image here on the right, what they usually do with pollinator gardens, which I'm sure most of you guys know this already, but they cluster the similar flowers together because it increases the visual and the scent cues, but they also mix in colors. So they mix the yellows and the purples together. So it functions as like a rainbow effect. And so that's going to be very successful at bringing in some of these neat pollinators that we've discovered today. Does anyone have questions for me?
We did have some questions. Well, there was some discussion about the protozoa OE, and are the wasps involved in bringing OB from one plant to another?
Actually, you said protozoan?
Yeah,
I have never heard of that before. I'm gonna have to look that up. I'm gonna put that on my list to look up because I haven't heard about that before. I do know that the only thing I have heard is that bees and wasps are actually able to transfer like parasitoid flies to the nest, but I haven't heard about a protozoan being transferred.
so can you elaborate a little bit on that?
Yeah, okay. So the thing that I discovered was that while there are some of those flies that are actually pollinators, there's a group of flies, I believe the tachinid flies, which are like parasitoids, they're very small parasitoid flies, is that I believe they lay their eggs on bees and wasps and they can I think it's wasps, and they can transfer that to the hive. So they are parasitoids. So the thing that you have to keep in mind with some of the insects that eat other insects is that they do eat pest insects a lot. And so that's important. So tachinids are actually beneficial as well. But the problem is that they're not only going to go after the bad insects, they're sometimes going to target good insects too. So sometimes wasps will target butterflies, sometimes spiders will target, moths or bees or whatever it might be. And so there's sometimes where, it's a balance of nature. And so sometimes those parasitoid flies are going to end up on your wasps and your bees and butterflies and other flying insects that visit flowers. And so they're going to die as well. But it's not in such to my experience, it's not in such a mass effect that it's detrimental to the species in general, because a lot of those wasp species are very aggressive. And so they lay so many eggs and they have so many brood that they're essentially going to outnumber those parasitoids. Most parasitoids are only laying 1 or 2 eggs. They're not laying like en masse, like aphids and some of those other things. So it's not really a major concern.
One of the things that I've found is that hummingbirds also love mint, my mint plants. And also there has been a thing which I thought was a wasp or a bumblebee. It was, and thanks for making your presentation. I've learned something. It's a hoverfly. I was going to try to get somebody to identify it, but thanks to you, you have identified it. But the hoverfly and the hummingbirds love those mint flowers.
Yeah, that so we have mint, I believe it was peppermint that we grew on the farm. It's not part of our urban garden, but it is part of the actually, you know what, they did plant mint there. But the fact that we can smell it from far away, that aromatic essential oils and like the hormones that they release are on purpose, by the way, are there to attract those pollinators. So that is why they are. So when you see a plant that has, because you see some plants and you see like one pollinator there, whatever it might be, but you see some like the mountain laurel, for example, where it's just covered in pollinators, or like the milkweed or the coneflower or the peppermint. That is the very strong aromatic essential oils and hormones that they're releasing that are drawing those in. So it's almost like it's a hypnotic effect to draw those pollinators in, because those plants depend directly on pollinators. I believe it's 80% of plants on planet Earth depend on direct pollination by an animal.
I have another question for you, Nathan. Is this on the number of insects in the world? We've been reading that the numbers are going down. Can you address that and what the implications of that are?
Yes, that is correct. So for monarch, I don't know what the number is for each like group of insects, but I know that for monarchs, which are also an important pollinator, not really unique, but certainly still important, that they used to be at, if I'm correct, 50 million when it was during the migrations, and I believe that's down to like 10 million now. So it is steady going down, and the reason for that is two primary reasons, which I strongly try to address whenever I'm dealing with agriculture, especially, is urbanization. So the fact that we're building and building and building, we're building malls and stores and all these homes and things like that. and we're completely cutting down their habitats. And not only are they dying because of that, because of the cut down of the habitats, but they're losing their food sources because of it. So the home that my parents used to live at until like a couple of months ago, it used to be surrounded by lots of woodlands and forests. That has all been deforested and cut down and removed in order to build a very large suburban area filled with stores and homes and stuff like that. So that is also that is contributing to the reduction of insects and other animal population. The other thing that's contributing, which I think is less of a contributor now that we're educating people, but it's still there, is the use of chemicals and pesticides. So the interesting thing is that even the use of fungicides, rodenticides, and herbicides is still harming insects, because the thing that I have learned and that I found very interesting is that the active sites and the way in which chemicals affect and hinder and kill living things is very similar. So you look at a plant, you look at a rodent, you look at fungi, you look at humans, and you look at insects, some of their genetics kind of line up. And those genetics, the parts that are affected by chemicals, is what's reducing that population. So if you spray something to control weeds, it can end up being a major problem for insects as well, even though it's not an insecticide. So those are, I would say, my two primary reasons for why the population of insects is declining on planet Earth.
This past year, I planted 3 butterfly gardens. I got a mixture of seeds. They had all kind of things in them. And each one of them has just been covered. They're still blooming and been covered with monarchs and other things. Am I making a contribution, or am I just making myself feel good that I may be doing something?
No, you're making a contribution. So remember I mentioned the thing about the aromatic and the hypnotic effect and all that. So when you're planting these gardens, especially if they're like really like, you're planting a garden that's like all these different types of blooms and things like that, the pollinators are coming. And so what happens is pollinators aren't just, with a few exceptions, pollinators aren't just seeing like for example, the one we planted at Prairie View. They're not just going to see that, go grab nectar, pollen, or whatever, and then leave. Typically what will happen is pollinators want to live near those areas. So like your butterflies will a lot of times, and your moths and your bees and all sorts of other animals will tend to either return to that area or stay near that area. So building these way stations and protected areas, you're actually making these function as a replacement. So if you have let's say you have a forest that gets torn down or a prairie that gets mowed over, if you go and if you have a porch in like an apartment and you plant a whole bunch of different plants and you put like up like a little beehive, like a bee stop or whatever, and you put out overripe fruit just in your little patio, insects will consider that a home. So you'll start getting spiders that spin their little webs there. Hummingbirds might even shelter there. Of course, they run away from humans, but when you're not out there, they might shelter there. So even on a small scale, these pollinator gardens and way stations and safe zones are really making a big difference. And so I encourage every single person to get involved, whether it's doing something on their porch, their backyard, planting a vegetable garden as a safe haven for, your bees and your wasps and other beneficial insects, because honestly, any plants are good for protecting insects because they absolutely need shelter and water. And so that's where they're getting that from. So I will say, yes, you're 100% making a contribution.
Are there public demonstration gardens associated with Prairie View A&M Extension Service? And if so, where are they located?
Right now, we have one that we have. So with COVID, we kind of had to take things slowly, but we also had some issues with, budget and some other stuff. So what I will say is that has been very successful because the team has come together and put that together really well. And so the urban garden station at Prairie View is on their farm. And it's a very quick drive. It's probably like less than 2 minutes or so from Prairie View itself, or from the university itself. and it is vegetables, there's fruits, blueberries, there's I believe there's citrus plants, papaya. We've got an entire pollinator garden, so vinca, and I believe it's violets that I planted. I think that's what that was, as well as several other plants that are very common at the store. So some of these plants aren't listed as pollinator plants, but pollinators still need those plants and still see those as a good source of pollen and nectar. And so that right now is our only one, but I would like to, we have other urban gardens. There's one at Jones Elementary for the young people to be able to be involved with. And so the goal is to start branching out and putting out more of those so that people can visit and see the pollinators and see the progress. And just because it's nice to look at and it's a nice place to hang out and enjoy the different species. So that's where we are at right now.
The only other question I had was, at night when you go see plants at night, you will see moths on those plants. How does that work since there's not much light for the color?
Yeah, that is very interesting. So moths and bats and some of your other night flying insects, and insects in general don't really have a good sense of sight anyway, other than the ultraviolet. So they can't really see, like, if they look at a human, they won't really see a full image. They won't see what you look like. They really just see light and color. So as you mentioned, how do they see the color? So they are using the light of the moon and the remaining light. So it's very similar to, this is my understanding of it. I may be wrong, but this is how I thought it worked. So it's similar to cats where they have like that reflection of light and then it reflects back and then it kind of functions as like a mini flashlight. That's how I've always done it. But I know that I've always thought it worked that way. But I know that insects also have an incredible sense of smell. So that can also help as well.
Well, Nathan, you got some really good reviews. Several people pointed out how much they really appreciate it. And I wanted to point out that if you get on the Prairie View Cooperative Extension homepage, you will see that he has some really excellent educational materials that you could probably use for children to adults. And you have a video, it looks like it's for children, about pollinators. I recommend you get on his, look him up, and you will see a lot of educational material, and you also see stuff that you could use with children. Is that correct, Nathan?
Oh yeah, absolutely. That was one of our main focuses with developing some of the content, was to make it user friendly for all ages. And because, essentially I want to prepare like the future generations to rise up and be able to essentially establish pollinator gardens and have an understanding of insects, because there's a lot of fear behind insects, and I want people to realize they are actually on our side and doing a lot of good for our crops and our livestock, our environments, even urban areas. They're functioning as beneficial 100%. Yes, there are pests, but I would say the majority of insects are definitely beneficial. And so I try to tailor things to be kid friendly, just because I want kids to understand, but I also want them to be interested and invested in it as well.
Well, I think those videos do that. And thank you very much, Nathan. We really appreciate you spending your evening with us.
All right, thank you guys.